From the intermission. My name's Emily May. I'm the agricultural conservation lead with the pesticide reduction program at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And I've been with Xerces for about a decade and got into nocturnal pollinators a few years ago as a few papers came out talking about the importance of night active insects for pollination. So I'm very excited to talk about nighttime pollination and who's doing it, how much they're contributing to wild plants and crops, and how they're affected by some of the same things as daytime pollinators, but also things like artificial light at night. So I will just dive right in. When we think about pollination, or when we often have talked about pollinators at the summit over the years, we are picturing bees, probably butterflies, hummingbirds visiting flowers on a bright sunny day. And most of these pollinating animals are day active, diurnal. But if you search for images of pollination, you're going to find diurnal or daytime pollinators dominating the results. Makes a lot of sense. It's easier to take photos of pollinators during the daylight hours. But let's not sleep on nocturnal pollinators. Insect activity is actually on average a third higher at night. More than half of invertebrates are active at night, and a growing body of research is shedding light on how important moths and other nighttime visitors are for pollination of plants. This figure is a simple example of how nocturnal pollinators, like moths, can contribute a lot of interactions and functions to networks of plants and their pollinators beyond what we can see during the day. It's not just wild plants that benefit from nighttime visitation. There were studies done in Arkansas that found that nocturnal insect visitors, especially moths, contribute significantly to pollination of apples. Pollination during the night shift in apples was almost equal to that of daytime pollinators like bees in its contribution to overall fruit set. There's other experimental evidence showing how much nighttime visitors are contributing to blueberries, brambles, other fruit crops, and observational evidence of night activity in a wide range of other crops. But these animals are really understudied, partly because a lot of the research is conducted by daytime animals, us. And so big kudos going out to the researchers that are out there pursuing this observational work at night. We also know there are some unique challenges and threats to nighttime pollinators. More than half of the United States experiences light pollution at night, and the area that's affected by light is growing every year. Artificial lighting can disrupt navigation and mating. It can reduce flower visits and fruit set by nocturnal visitors. So we'll talk more about this and solutions towards the end. But first, let's dive into the pollinator night shift. How or why does pollination happen at night? There's many pollinators that visit during the day, and some flowers actually tuck themselves up at night when darkness falls. But there's lots of flowers that remain open at night with nectar available, and some actually open exclusively at night or have evolved to attract nighttime pollinators. Evening primrose got its name from its nyctinasty, which is a behavior of opening petals at dusk. Sometimes nyctinasty can also mean closing petals in response to light. But when I was a kid, my family would walk up the street to watch my neighbor's evening primrose pop open in the evening. It's kind of a spectacle. So why would flowers do that? Why would they bloom at night? A review of all the plant families and species found that nocturnal pollination tends to be associated with species that also have water loss adaptations. So flowering at night can, in some cases, be an adaptation to water stress. A lot of nocturnal species are xeric. Flowering is a very water-intensive process, and there's orders of magnitude in difference between the light intensity on a sunny day and the light intensity at night. It's about 1,000,000 degrees of difference between a sunny day and a full moon, and even a few more orders of magnitude more for a moonless night. So nighttime is bringing lower temperatures, higher humidity, typically lower wind speeds, all of which are associated with less loss of water. And so plants that are facing that water stress might gain an advantage by flowering at night, where they're less likely to lose water through evapotranspiration. The flowers pictured here are a species of cactus found in the Sonoran Desert that put out these incredibly showy blooms for one night in June or July, and then look pretty unremarkable for the rest of the year. So that this is allowing those plants to produce flowers that are larger or have more rewards um, at night. They may also have evolved specifically to benefit from nighttime pollinator visits. So insect activity, as I said, is higher at night, and that's for many reasons, but in particular that darkness can be helpful for avoiding predators. So flowers that are open at night or that give their rewards at night may be taking advantage of this higher level of insect activity. There's lots of flowers visited by both daytime and nighttime pollinators, but some flowers have evolved specific features to attract nighttime visitors. For example, light is limited when the sun goes down. So some of these flowers may be appealing to nighttime pollinators by being white or pale, helping them to reflect what light is left and contrast well in the dark. Another common feature is the production of strong fragrance. So following your nose or your antenna might be easier than your eyes in the dark. So many daytime flowers are fragrant, but some nighttime flowers time the release of their fragrance or time the release of nectar for the evening. There's lots of insects and other animals that are active at night. There's sort of four main groups of nocturnal pollinators, moths being by far the largest and the most diverse, and the one we're going to talk about the most. There's tens of thousands of moth species active at night around the world. Um, and the rest of the nocturnal pollinators tend to be more concentrated close to the equator. So up north, we have moths and beetles and bees. In the Southwest US, we also have bat pollinators at night. Um, there's also evidence of nighttime pollination by other insects like flies, ants, and even crickets, sometimes some incidental pollination by fireflies, that sort of thing. So that way they would fall under beetles, of course. There's also been some from geckos and thrips and other insects and animals, but again, very understudied relative to our daytime pollinators. We live in a 24-hour cycle of light, so pollinators are like every other form of the animal world finding their niche. They're not neatly divided into daytime and nighttime. Some of them fall into the twilight zone at dawn and dusk. So many pollinators are active during that time. The term to describe that is crepuscular. Crepusculum is Latin for twilight zone. Not all moths are nocturnal. Not all bees are diurnal. So this here is a hawk moth or hummingbird moth, which sometimes might be mistaken for an actual hummingbird in your garden. Many of these are active in those dusk hours. Most bees are day active, but there are a few groups of bees that are active at dusk until there's very little light left in the sky. These would be crepuscular bees, or active at dusk and dawn, as I just mentioned. This slide shows two different species of Lasioglossum, which is a type of sweat bee. The bee on the left is Lasioglossum incompletum. It's a day active species of sweat bee that's a generalist visitor of many different kinds of flowers. The bee on the right, Lasioglossum texanum, is a crepuscular species of sweat bee. So like many of the bees that come out at twilight, it's a specialist on flowers in the evening primrose family that start blooming at dusk. So what differences do you notice about these two bees? Did you notice up at the top this size difference between these structures? So if you think bees only have two eyes, think again, they actually have five. These three round things on the top of bees' heads are actually simple eyes called ocelli that take in light and help bees orient their position relative to the sun. So crepuscular bee, active in less light, has evolved to have a much larger ocelli in order to take in more light when flying for evening primrose adventures. There are some crepuscular bees active up in the upper Midwest and Northeast, including the squash bee, which is commonly active at dawn and dusk. They come out 2 hours earlier or so, 1 to 2 hours earlier than other squash pollinators like bumblebees. So I made the mistake when I was a senior in college of trying to study squash bees, which really did not work for my sleep schedule at the time. I should have known better. So we have bees that fly in the dawn and dusk hours in dim light. There are a few independent groups of bees that are truly nocturnal. There's one species that's been seen flying on moonless nights, which is the large carpenter bee up at the top there, native to Southeast Asia. It typically doesn't fly in total darkness, but it is very active on nights when the moon is out. And you can see how large those ocelli are on the top of its head. The nocturnal sweat bee, Megaleptogenalis, which is the photo on the bottom, is a large-bodied sweat bee species that lives in the rainforest understory, and its compound eyes are almost 30 times more sensitive to light than worker honeybees. They have whole pathways of neurons that are devoted to processing the information that comes in. So it's kind of like in movies when you have somebody looking at a camera footage and you say, stop, zoom in. And then it somehow magically makes the footage clearer. And that's what the sweat bee is doing with the limited amount of light information coming in. It's rendering lots of detail from very little light information. There's also, of course, beetle pollination at night, which is very understudied relative even to bees and moths. Some beetle pollination is occurring during the day, which is what I have a photo of on the right. On the left here is a fly and beetle pollinated flower, wild ginger, which is native up here where I am in New England. The flowers are inconspicuous, and at the base of the plant, they smell like carrion, and flies and beetles are attracted in by the scent and may hang out in the flower. Magnolias are famously beetle pollinated. This beetle on the right here is a day active scarab beetle, but I love that it shows how those hairy beetle bodies could pick up and move pollen around. And there are scarab beetles active at night that may be visiting flowers. But now I'm going to turn and do a deep dive into moths because they really are the major players in nocturnal pollination. So what do they look like? What's their life history? What role are they playing in our world? Moths are extremely abundant and diverse, with over 160,000 described species around the world. The US alone has around 11,000 species of moth. This is many times more than described species of bees. We only have 20,000 species of described bees around the world. About 75% of these species are active at night. This is a really rich graphic. I don't expect you to see all the detail here, but it's showing the evolutionary tree of moths and butterflies and the diversity of shapes and sizes. Moths have been around for about 300 million years, with an explosion in diversity after the arrival of flowering plants. And they've been mostly nocturnal for most of this time. There's a few sublineages that have independently evolved being active in the daytime. For example, butterflies, which are a subgroup of Lepidoptera, evolved from moths that are primarily day active. There's a few other distinguishing characteristics of butterflies, like having a knobbed antennae, forming a hard shell called a chrysalis, rather than spinning a cocoon when they pupate. But here they are, butterflies, right in the middle of the moth family tree. So I can understand the folks who say there's no such thing as a butterfly, only moths. But no matter their size or their shape or their habitat, butterflies and moths are all following the same basic blueprint for their life cycle, which is complete metamorphosis. This is a fabulously ecologically interesting way to live. This is the moth life cycle, starting as an egg laid in or near a host plant, laid on or near a host plant, which hatches into a larva or caterpillar. Those caterpillars go through multiple instars, where the larva sheds its skin to keep growing. Then when ready, the final instar larva spins a cocoon and remains dormant inside as a pupa until the environment signals the right conditions to emerge. Then the moth emerges and becomes an adult, finds a mate, lays eggs, starts the process over again. The adult life stage, which is really the one we're talking about when we're talking about pollination, is often the shortest. Some species are only out for a day or two. They really are just here to reproduce and mate. Many of those lack mouth parts because their sole purpose at that point is to reproduce. But others can live weeks to months as adults, spending time visiting visiting flowers for nectar. Before I talk more about pollination, I really just want to take a step back and remind all of us how much our world depends on butterflies and moths in really fundamental ways. These animals have relationships with plants that date back tens of millions of years. And caterpillars are what take this lush and dense and largely indigestible plant biomass and turn it into very easily digestible protein and fat for other wildlife. So this is just an absolute unit of a caterpillar. This is a Cecropia moth. I thought my toddler grew fast, but this baby weighed 3 milligrams at birth and then grew to 5,000 times its size within a month. So caterpillars specialize in growth. They transform plants into fatty snacks really fast. And overall, this is just a wonderful and life-giving process. But being the coveted snack does come with its downsides. So the mortality rate for caterpillars of some species is over 90%. Only a small percentage are making it through this gauntlet of predation, pathogens, etc. So some of the amazing diversity of moths, and the reason many are active at night, comes from the extremely strong pressure to evade predators. The moth on the left is aptly named a bird-dropping moth for obvious reasons. On the right, this is a peppered moth that spends its day resting against tree trunks, trying to avoid notice by potential predators. If you recognize the peppered moth, it has a very neat evolution story. It evolved rapidly to get darker during the Industrial Revolution, when pollution killed off lichens and darkened the bark of trees in industrial areas of England. So if you're not familiar with that story, definitely look it up. So now we have some idea of what moths look like and the diversity there, but let's switch gears and talk about behavior. One thing we're probably all familiar with is moths' affinity for light. We've all seen our moths around our porch lights. So why are they so attracted to light? Many moths navigate by something called transverse orientation, which is a strategy where they maintain a fixed angle to a distant light source, such as the moon, to stay on course, same way sailors navigated using the North Star. So when they're using that distant light source to navigate, and when they're using a light source that's much closer than the moon, they have to keep adjusting their flight path, and so they often are spiraling in or crashing. So this is disrupting. It means they've become the butt of a lot of jokes and internet memes. I don't think the moths would laugh at these as much as we do, because artificial light can really be quite disruptive and disrupt their ability to search for and find mates. Instead of a nose, another piece of their movement, moths have antennae to sense smells. So their sense of smell is used to locate flowers to nectar on, to locate host plants to lay their eggs on, as well as to find mates to reproduce with in the dark. Males typically have much larger feathery antennae, and not just because females swoon at the sight of such large antennae, but female moths are emitting pheromones, which the males have to find in order to find a mate. So their sense of smell is heightened with these feathery antennae, and they are able to go find their female to mate with. Heavily fragrant flowers are also thus easier for moths to find at night. Once moths have emerged as an adult, their lives can take very different paths. So some, like Luna moths and other silk moths, these gorgeous moths in the Saturniid family, don't eat at all as adults. They're relying on fat stored from their caterpillar stage, and they just live a couple of days and focus on mating. Other moths, like noctuid moths, use their long proboscis to sip on nectar to fuel their flight and extend their lifespan out weeks to even, in some cases, months. This difference shapes their role in ecosystems. Species like Luna moths are these incredible walking hot dogs of caterpillars, but not contributing much to pollination. The real workhorses of nocturnal pollination are likely these longer-lived adults visiting flowers for nectar. Most of the nectar-feeding moths are generalists, visiting a lot of the same plants visited during the day by bees for nectar. Many carry pollen on their underbellies. Some also carry around their mouth parts where they're interacting with the plant. A study in England went out into agricultural fields and collected the pollen from the underbellies of moths. They surveyed hundreds of moths, sampling from their belly and their proboscis to figure out where they'd been. And in that study area, the pollen transport network at night contained over 100 species of moths and dozens of plant species, including some plants visited frequently during the day, and some that were really mostly visited at night. There were a couple of key families of moths that carried a lot of pollen, particularly Noctuidae and Erebidae. They were carrying on their bellies and in their mouths. So this was just one study. There are about 22 studies of bees for every one study that's looked at moths. So we have a lot left to learn about who the pollinators are and what they're pollinating. But researchers are working on some methods for making it easier for us daytime animals to study nighttime pollinators without sacrificing sleep. There was a recent study that used time-lapse cameras to capture nocturnal flower visits and found to red clover. And they found that moths are providing over a third of total flower visits to red clover. So they've been really systematically overlooked in their contributions there. They also contribute to crop pollination of different crops, as I mentioned before. There was another recent study finding that moths are very efficient pollinators of blackberry flowers, bramble flowers, raspberries as well. The study authors experimentally bagged clusters of flowers. This is a classic pollination technique. And they left some open only during the day, some open only at night. And they found that more insects visited flowers during the day, but the nighttime pollinators, like moths, were actually depositing more pollen per visit. So they were more efficient. So if you think about it, it makes sense that moths could be pretty good pollinators of some of these open flowers. This is a photo here from Stephen Robertson in Arkansas, showing a fall armyworm moth vibrating her wings when visiting an apple flower at night. This is almost like the vibrating behavior, buzz pollination behavior that bees use to get more pollen out of flowers. So it's actually helping her keep warm at night, but it's also getting a lot of pollen onto her very fluffy body. So I love this in part because it shows that you can't judge a book by its initial cover. Fall armyworm moths can be pests of some crops as caterpillars, but then this is also her story, right? She's pollinating a crop as an adult. So they're more complex than what they're made out to be. Moths also might be important in terms of pollination as a whole for maintaining genetic diversity and gene flow in plant populations across long distances. We talk a lot about bees as very important pollinators, but female bees are limited in how far they can travel. They build a nest, below ground or in a plant stem, and then forage for pollen and nectar in an area around that central nest site. So they might only travel a couple hundred meters from their nest site, not moving pollen beyond a certain radius. Moths, on the other hand, are not nest builders. They are not tied to a nest site. They can move long distances. So under the right conditions, a migratory moth might fly a few hundred kilometers in a single night. So mobile moths could move pollen between quite distant plant populations. Some moths and plants that we know about do have very special relationships, like some of the plant and bee relationships, like squash and squash bees. This is a yucca moth and a yucca flower. These moths exclusively pollinate plants in the yucca genus. Yuccas don't make nectar, so other pollinators have very little reason to visit them. This little yucca moth only lives for 2 days and doesn't have mouth parts because it's so short-lived. So it will mate inside a yucca flower, and then the female will purposefully gather pollen from the flower, fly to another yucca plant, and then stuff the pollen she carried with her on the stigma of the flower and lay a few eggs on the ovary of that flower. So she is very intentionally pollinating the yucca plant so that the eggs that are laid in that flower will have yucca fruit to eat, and the yucca is then able to produce seeds. This is another fun, special moth-plant relationship. There's a giant hawk moth endemic to Madagascar. That's the photo on the right. It was discovered in the late 1800s, but its existence was predicted 20 years earlier by Charles Darwin sitting in a London office inspecting an orchid, the Star of Bethlehem orchid, sent in by a colleague. The specimen featured a foot-long nectar spur, with the nectar itself only at the very bottom of the spur. And Darwin wrote in a letter to the friend, "Good heavens, what insect can suck it?" So Darwin predicted that scientists would one day discover the orchid's partner in coevolution, which would be an insect with a foot-long proboscis. 2 decades later, they discovered this hawk moth and lent support to Darwin's theory of coevolution between plants and pollinators. So just as we're starting to better understand the contribution of nighttime pollinators to the pollination of crops and wild plants, there's increasing research that's also pointing to the negative impacts of light pollution and artificial light at night on nocturnal pollinator activity and reproduction of both the nighttime pollinators and their plants. There was a study in Switzerland that looked at the pollination of cabbage thistle, a species that grows there. They looked at it with and without artificial lighting. So they basically put a street lamp over the plants. They found that the thistles that had artificial lighting on top had 62% fewer insect visits and 29% decline in pollinator species and a significant reduction in fruit set. They produced fewer developed fruits than the ones that were in darkness. And daytime pollinators weren't able to make up for the loss of nighttime pollination. This disruption by artificial light was affecting not just moths, but a range of other nocturnal pollinators as well. So what can we do to conserve our nocturnal pollinators? There's some pretty key actions we can take, many of which are the same as what we do for daytime pollinators. We want to provide habitat or food and shelter. If for nighttime pollinators, we want to reduce artificial lighting around our homes and communities, avoid pesticides, especially in a near habitat, and then talk to our friends and neighbors and communities to spread the love of moths and other nighttime insects. As gardeners, we can take a variety of steps to create better habitat for nighttime pollinators. You likely already have dozens, if not hundreds, of different kinds of night active insects in your yard. And some of the general rules of thumb are the same as for daytime pollinators. We want to increase native plantings, decrease hard surfaces, and we want to plant a diversity of native plants to attract a diversity of native insects. I'll talk more about that though. For moths, we can be thinking outside of the box for pollinators. We're not just talking about flowering native plants, but all of the diversity of native plant life. Native trees make for incredible caterpillar food and shelter. Oaks, maples, willows, beeches, birch, poplars, you name a native tree and there are going to be caterpillars who would love to turn it into protein and fat for birds. For adults that are nectar feeding, you want to make sure you have nectar plants providing a steady source of fuel through the season. And there's so many great options for this, many of which are also caterpillar food, things like milkweeds, joe pie, blazing star, bee balm. A lot of plants in the mint and pea and aster families are a good start. Evening primrose is also a wonderful moth plant for all the reasons I talked about earlier. It pops open and offers its nectar right at the beginning of the evening. And if you want to talk about specific plants, I'm happy to talk more about that. But this is some general rule of thumb: caterpillar food and adult fuel. We want to do more by doing less. Less tidy is generally better for insects. So one of the easiest ways to make your garden better for moths is just to stop working so hard. Moths and their caterpillars need fallen leaves, old stem, other plant debris to help them hide from predators and to provide good shelter and overwintering site. This is a blinded sphinx. Look at how good of a leaf mimic that is. There's so many other great examples of moths that are camouflaging either as a larvae or as an adult with the leaves. So it's helpful to just be less tidy. Try leaving some old plant material behind the backs of borders or in other places out of sight if you don't like it right out front. So leaving the leaves and stems is very helpful for these messy pollinators. Give yourself a pat on the back for gardening for wildlife. We have lots of resources at Xerces available on this. Also happy to talk more about it. There's other steps to take in our yards that are more specific to nighttime pollinators. So as I mentioned, artificial lighting at night is a significant threat to nighttime pollinators. It can disrupt their natural behaviors, their circadian rhythm, their navigation, and can leave them more open and at risk from predation. Much of that artificial light at night It's not actually needed, especially when our daytime animals are asleep. So the first thing that I recommend to you is just to go out at night and observe your space. Trying to take an insect's perspective, remembering that a night active insect is going to be many times more sensitive to those tiny differences in light than we are. So what light do you see? Are you seeing a splash of light from your windows onto your garden? Do you or your neighbors have party lighting over the patio or vanity lighting on the exterior of the house? Is there an obvious street light or a floodlight that you can see? What about sky glow from your city? So this is just a starting point, an exercise to help you understand light pollution in your local environment. The best way to protect moths and other nocturnal insects from light pollution is to reduce that artificial light in both space and time. There's research that's been done on fireflies and glowworms, suggesting that light intensity and not color temperature is the main driver of disrupted mate finding for some species. So in some cases, you can change the light spectrum of your artificial light from cold to warm, install red LEDs or gel filters over existing lights. And that can be a good step for reducing some level of disruption to insects as well as our own circadian rhythms, but it's not the solution for every insect. So more generally, we need to be turning lights off. There are some steps you can take for your own house or your apartment to reduce light pollution. For me, I realized that I was just letting a ton of light out in the time between when I get off work and then light goes out at night and when I go to bed. So putting up curtains and shades that I'm keeping closed while I'm watching a show at night, for example. Also using motion detectors and timers for outdoor lighting. So another question to ask yourself is really to think about, does the lighting have a clear purpose? Is it needed? Is it targeted? In my experience, there's a lot of lights that can just be kept off most of the time. And then you can use a motion detector for when you do want light. So whether that's from moving from your car into the house or for the feeling of safety from lights turning on when there's some kind of motion outside. For lights that can't be turned off or can't be motion detected, you can dim or shield or hood outdoor lighting if turning them off isn't an option. Dark Sky International has really great resources available for helping you kind of think through those questions about whether light has a clear purpose and whether it's targeted. Sometimes though we've done everything we can about our own lighting and we're gardening in places where there's a lot of outdoor lighting we don't control, like cities. So you can also think about how you could maybe create some dark zones. Thinking of light like a pollutant, how can you protect your garden? You could plant trees or shrubs to try and block or absorb artificial lighting from your neighbors, just like you might plant dense vegetation to protect your garden from your neighbor's pesticide applications. So creating those darker spaces with vegetation might be helpful in creating some zones that are dark enough for nocturnal insects to be able to persist and navigate. Another important step in managing these spaces for pollinators is limiting pesticide contamination. So just like for daytime pollinators, if we're planting attractive plantings for nighttime pollinators, we're wanting to avoid pesticide use in our yards and gardens. There's a lot of pesticides available for home and garden use that are harmful to moths, fireflies, other nocturnal insects. These include things like the backyard barrier treatments that are applied for mosquitoes or ticks, the granular treatments for grub control in lawns. Even things like neem oil and soaps are harmful to caterpillars. So we want to be cautious. We don't want to create ecological traps where we've planted native plants, we've attracted in beneficial insects, and then we're accidentally harming them with pesticide applications. Part of managing gardens for wildlife is shifting expectations about the aesthetic of gardens. So signs of plant damage from insects means that you are doing it right. Insects are using your garden. When your garden produces a ton of fat and happy caterpillars, you are making a lot of fat and happy birds. One of the things that I've really loved over the recent years is the proliferation of the smartphone apps and camera apps that can help you identify things you don't already recognize. Suddenly, you can know and observe and realize just how many different kinds of insects your garden can support. and it helps you learn about those specialized relationships. Just as one example, I planted Pearly Everlasting in my garden, and it got eaten down almost to the ground level, covered in frost, covered in caterpillars. And I used one of those camera apps because I didn't recognize the caterpillar right away. It was an American lady butterfly caterpillar. Um, and there were just dozens of them on this plant. I thought there's no way this plant's going to survive, but I let them be. Um, the caterpillars did their thing. They went through their life cycle. Many of them became butterflies. Some of them became bird food. And then later on in the season, that plant was just lush. It looked like nothing had ever happened to it. It was amazing. And it's helpful to remember that sometimes you just need to pause, take a breath, and know that these plants have had relationships with these animals for millions of years, and they have all adapted ways to grow through some of this damage. They're adapted to it. So that was just a helpful piece of the story for me, is recognizing that sometimes the plants are meant to be eaten in that way, and they're going to be growing back out through it and looking beautiful after the fact. So um, just shifting perspective, taking a breath, taking a pause to help recognize what's using your garden can be very helpful. It's clear that nocturnal pollinators are playing important roles in plant communities and natural ecosystems, but we have tons more to learn about the details of their plant pollinator relationships, species interactions, what they really need in their habitat, and how we can best support them. But I hope I've whetted your interest for learning more right along with me. So I wanted to give thanks to our many supporters at Xerces, especially our membership. And I know I'm not taking Q&A at this time, but feel free to add questions and I'm happy to try and answer them later or reach out to me at emilymay@xerces.org. So thank you very much.